Hey everyone, welcome to episode 71 of the Julia LaRoche Show. Today's guest is Omeed Malik. He is the founder and CEO of Farvahar Partners, which is a boutique investment bank that helps private companies raise capital and go public. Omeed is also behind the SPAC called Colombier, which is taking PublicSq, think of it as a marketplace for patriotic businesses, taking that company public. He is also part of the team at 1789 Capital, which is an investment firm that says it will provide capital to companies building the next era of American prosperity. I've known Omeed for almost a decade. Our paths crossed back when I was a hedge fund reporter and he was working in the prime brokerage at Bank of America, Merrill Lynch. In this episode, we got Omeed's macro view, and we also got his thesis on what he sees as this emerging parallel economy here in the US that is in stark contrast to ESG, environmental social governance, as you know, and that economy is what he's kind of classified as EIG, companies that are focused on entrepreneurship, innovation, and growth. We do a deep dive into his thesis there, and you kind of see how all the different threads from his background in politics, law, also finance, intersect into this larger macro trend that he sees. I really enjoyed this conversation with Omeed. I certainly learned a lot. I also learned a lot about his own background, things that I personally didn't know. And I think that you will enjoy it as well. Please be sure to leave a rating and a review so more folks can find this episode. And also for the folks watching, please be sure to hit that like button and that bell so you can subscribe and you won't miss any future episodes. Your support helps me bring more of these long form discussions, so it means so much. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Omeed Malik. Omeed Malik, founder and CEO of Farvahar Partners, which for those watching and listening is a boutique investment bank focused in the private space. And Omeed, you and I have known each other for almost a decade, both coming from the hedge fund world, myself as a journalist, and you working in that world, in the prime brokerage space. It is so great to welcome you on the show and great to see you again, Omeed.
Yeah, congrats on all the success. Excited to be here.
Well, likewise. And I mentioned that we've known each other for about a decade, but I'll be honest, I actually don't know your full story. And I was kind of hoping we could start there, a bit about, your personal background, your personal journey.
Sure. Yeah. When you met me, I was running prime brokerage, as you said, at Bank of America, and I was, pretty public at a lot of the conferences. I think it was actually the SALT conference that we used to see each other at that Scaramucci used to run. And that was a great conference because it brought together a lot of the stuff that I've been interested in my entire life. You had accomplished folks from politics, finance, coming together and having conversations. And so I really enjoyed always going there and sometimes interviewing, very interesting people from those worlds. And so it was nice to interact with you during that period. But prior to that, I actually started as a speechwriter in Washington, D.C. when I graduated college. So my interest was not in finance when I was young. I was a double major in philosophy and political science. So I did not think I would be on Wall Street, 20 years later now or what have you. I went to Washington, and then from there, like many people, I went to law school. And after I practiced law for about 4 or 5 years in New York at a large firm called Weil Gotshal, but it was mostly in the corporate space. So that's when I started to learn more about the world that we're in. And what some people don't know is that I actually didn't go directly to Bank of America. I had a very interesting interlude at around 30 years old when I left the law. I actually went to go work for John Corzine, who used to be the senator and governor of New Jersey. And prior to that, he was the CEO of Goldman Sachs. He had lost the governorship race in 2010 to Chris Christie and was making a comeback on Wall Street. And as I had mentioned to you, I had known him from a decade earlier when I was in Washington right out of college. And he hired me to come over to MF Global. And it was an amazing experience to kind of be his deputy at that time. And so at a very young age, I developed a wide array of relationships. But as you also know, as a journalist, we then filed about a year and a half later, the 10th largest bankruptcy in US history. So also to see that kind of tumultuousness up front, I thought thought was a very good experience early on. And then I went over to B of A, and that's when we started interacting and rose up pretty quickly and was running prime brokerage and capital introductions. But what I do now is totally different. In 2018, as you mentioned, I started my own firm and have gotten more into entrepreneurship. And what we do at Farvahar is we help advise, raise capital for these high growth venture-backed businesses before they go public. And so I thought there would be a unique opportunity based on my Rolodex to advise the founders of these businesses, and now go in my fourth or fifth career. And I've loved doing that. And all the while I've opened up myself to other opportunities, and we'll talk about them today, but I've also seen an opportunity in a new ecosystem or economy that's sprouting up that I call the Patriot economy, or as we've designated, Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Growth, or EIG, which stands in stark contrast to ESG, which we think there's a big backlash coming to. Yeah. So I'll stop there, but hopefully that was helpful context.
There's so many. Wow, you've done a lot, and you're a pretty young guy too. Like, you've done a lot in your career, so that's just really incredible to think about. Like, I have just a bunch of questions. Okay,
sure.
And it might seem weird to even go back here, but how does one become a speechwriter? And what was that like? Who were you working with? Who were you writing speeches for? It sounds like that was right out of school.
Yeah, it was. I was working every summer and then right afterward for a congressman and then a senator, both from New Jersey, which is where I was born and grew up, but I was in DC. And the nice thing about that is, DC is a place where you get a lot of power at a young age, but you just don't make a lot of money. So you have to make a decision what matters more to you if you're ambitious. Do you like power and access or money? And at that time, I think I was probably more turned on to being in the mix of things. And so at a young age, you can be up there sitting behind your congressman or senator on a committee, and you'll be on C-SPAN. And I remember coming back at a very early age, having written a speech for a member and then going back home and then watching him read what I had just written. I mean, maybe 3 people were watching, but it felt good at the time. So you just apply. I had the background, and now it's interesting. At the time, those were all, Democrats, and now I'm looking at the world very differently. So from a personal standpoint, I don't think I've changed, but I think the country's changed dramatically. This is around 2001, 2000. Over the last 20 years, for a variety of geopolitical reasons, the views that I have, as well as domestic changes, have had me change kind of, I guess, who I support and what I'm passionate about. And we can get into some of that because it has a direct impact on what I'm doing professionally. But yeah, I was really quite involved as a donor, as well as professionally, as I just mentioned, in the Democratic Party writ large, from about 2001, 2000, all the way through about 2016, and then I started to see some changes.
Yeah, because I was like, I've kind of always known you as like,
I
think pretty well known, like a Democrat, like a lifelong Democrat.
Right.
Do you no longer identify as a Democrat, or?
Yeah, I definitely don't. And that's also because, I was kind of associated when I was much younger with Corzine, who obviously was one. And so people kind of affiliated that. And I think for the most part, I probably did fall into that. But I think there are certain issues that started to come much more to the forefront. Well, the first thing was the election of Trump in 2016. That didn't necessarily get me angry the way it did with other folks that lived with me on the Upper East Side in New York, as much as it made me question what happened here. How could we have missed this? And I wanted to learn more about a country that I had not spent as much time looking outside of the coasts. And it was clear that there were a lot of things that had happened during that period of time that were very bad for a large part of the country. And they wanted some comeuppance, basically. A few of those things were just the outsourcing of manufacturing that had occurred during that period, the overemphasis on globalization, and the rise of China. And so I started to look into the impact that China had had domestically. And again, this is not their fault necessarily. Our policymakers on both sides were happy to outsource everything to them. But that comes with a cost, especially when you add in 2 unnecessary wars in the Middle East, and people coming back from those wars without jobs, addicted to opioids, and you have a large swath of the population that feels hopeless. And I think that's why you look at the specific states in the industrial Midwest in particular that went from Democrat to Republican, I guess. Again, those terms themselves, I think, are antiquated, by the way, because what people don't talk about is there is a large portion of the population that voted for Obama twice and Trump twice. And so that's what I'm kind of focusing on, is this new kind of cohort of voters that probably have more in common with, let's call it like Trump and RFK Jr., who really recently announced on the Democratic side to challenge Biden, than they do with, let's say, Biden and like a Mike Pence. So this is fascinating to me. And then COVID obviously accelerated so many of the things I'm talking about. The lockdowns that I found to be overly draconian, particularly in blue states and unscientific, led to a diaspora outside of, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, to places like Florida, Texas, and Tennessee. And you start to see federalism with very, very distinct ways of governing. What kind of state do people want to live in? And the numbers demonstrate, and again, I'm speaking personally here again, I moved to Florida during that period as well, that we have very different visions for governance in this country. And I believe that the next step, and that's what we're talking about today, is that there will also be different visions, not just for politics, state by state, but for commerce as well.
Yeah. Even more follow-on questions, because you kind of talk about this evolution. It sounds like you're a pretty introspective guy as well. And I take it you didn't vote for Trump in 2016. I take it you voted for Hillary at the time. Was the evolution for you, was it fast? Was it slow? Like, can you kind of walk me through the process? Did you have like an aha moment in that?
There were definitely things in 2016 that I was like, whoa, I can't believe Trump said that. I totally agree. I mean, I think I'm classically liberal. One of the things that made me a Democrat during my 20s was I'm pretty anti-war, particularly dumb wars. So I was against the war in Iraq, and there was one side that was very for that with, George W. Bush. I thought that was like the biggest foreign policy blunder in modern American history, and I can prove that out. I won't belabor it here, but just it caused obviously an enormous amount of issues that we're still dealing with: the rise of ISIS, empowering our enemies, and of course, most importantly, the loss of innocent life, both Americans, and Iraqis, and trillions of dollars. By the way, we talk about the deficit, we never talk about the impact of these wars have on our deficit. But between Iraq and Afghanistan, it's close to 6 or 7 trillion. And even if you look at the failure of Afghanistan, that was the longest war in U.S. history. And at the end of it, we have the same guys in there that we wanted to kick out. The Taliban now runs Afghanistan. So I think, no one can look at that as a success. But it was somewhat, it took time. So I like the stuff that Trump was saying about the war, right? And saying these are silly. And he was almost being more anti-war than the Democrats were at the time. So that was kind of intriguing to me. And it seemed to me he was building a very different coalition. And obviously, again, if you look at the electoral map, he changed the electoral map in 2016. But I did not vote for him. And then as I started seeing his policies implemented, and again, I'm putting aside individuals here, I'm just looking at the policies, I thought that he was really on to something both domestically, and wages went up for the first time in 20 years. The economy was extremely strong. And then I also didn't view what the opposition was doing as, remotely respectable. I mean, they hired a special counsel, they investigated into him, the entire institutional media, corporate media, the FBI, intelligence agencies effectively all colluded to accuse him of being a Manchurian candidate, ripped the country apart during that period. And it was all false. And there've been no ramifications for that. It's very hard for me to accept that we said he was an agent of Russia. And then the FBI with Mueller comes out and says, well, we had no actual proof of this. So we just wasted 3 or 4 years. So it was these things that started to let me feel very skeptical of what was happening in the country. And that starts pushing you further and further away from where I was. And then ultimately, around 2018 or 19, you may recall I brought Tulsi Gabbard to one of the SALT conferences. And that's who I was, kind of still, with the party trying to hold on. And she was also looking at it from an anti-war stance. And what people don't remember necessarily is during that primary, the Democratic establishment absolutely ripped her. She's no longer a Democrat, by the way, either. They just went after her because of her stances on war and other things, because she wouldn't kowtow to like certain principles that they have. And when I saw the way that they treated her, who again is a war veteran and was still, enlisted during her time in Congress, I just said, this is kind of a bridge too far for me. And so that was probably the last straw. And that's when I started warming up more to, again, I don't want to call them classical Republicans, whoever this new set of people are, and started, supporting J.D. Vance, who won in the Senate in Ohio, Blake Masters, who did not win, but is incidentally now a business partner of ours, and some of these things we'll talk about. He had worked for Peter Thiel prior. But of course, really the icing on the cake was the COVID response and living in New York and just being, appalled at what they were doing. Everyone must stay at home, but then if you're protesting for something that they liked, it's okay, you won't catch the virus, kind of hypocrisy that made no sense to me. And then seeing the way that Governor DeSantis handled Florida, which was, I thought, a thing of beauty, cultivating a relationship with him, it just became very clear to me that not on party lines, but on issues that I felt strongly about, one side made it much easier for me to associate them with the other.
You mentioned a couple of things I wanted to explore with you. You mentioned the terms like Republican and Democrat being antiquated and kind of talking about this kind of new cohort of voters. Can I hear more of your thoughts there, more of your thesis?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, let's start with just the notion of like foreign entanglements. Now, I want to be clear, I'm quite hawkish on one particular country, and that's China. I look at them as the most significant geopolitical threat we've ever faced in my lifetime, more so than maybe the Soviet Union, because the Chinese have figured out how to play us. They understand that America, for better or for worse, is unabashedly capitalist. And this is also in furtherance of what we're talking about generally, which is this kind of lack or waning patriotism that we feel here. If your country is only about the bottom line, which in some portions of America has become that way, then there's really nothing cohesive about it. And that's why you see a lackadaisical border, no emphasis on a unifying language or culture, no shared sacrifice, only a volunteer army. And you start having absolutely no kind of social fabric. And China has manipulated that amazingly because they have over 1 billion people of demand. So they represent to our multinational corporations just an incredible opportunity to sell to them. And then they also provide cheap labor to also manufacture over there. And they've done this over the last 2 decades to horrible, horrible consequences to Americans who now don't have the same jobs they could rely on, and continue to enrich them not only by having stuff made over there, by purchasing it from there as well. This is an area where I would have thought that people who cared about the middle class, which I had historically associated with Democrats, would have cared about, but I don't see them even giving a damn about this issue at all. And they seem totally comfortable to kowtow to these donors of these corporations that don't, even though they're domiciled in the United States, don't have any loyalty to the U.S. Their loyalty is to their profits. And I understand that, but we as a country and as policymakers need to start getting more nationalistic. I know that might have negative connotations. Let's call it patriotic, if you will, to focus on this issue because we're hurting our own citizens. And so I think that issue in particular really just flows into like everything else. And so you necessarily are going to have a cohort of historically Democratic Union middle-class voters who are gravitating to this other side now. And by the way, the statistics completely support everything I'm saying. All of the Democrat Party now, if you look at their constituents, is the party of the coasts and the rich, just per capita. The richest people are Democrats, and now the middle class, lower middle class have become Republicans. It's flipped. So the same way we saw a flip of the Democratic and Republican parties in the 60s, mostly around civil rights, you now have had the next several generations later, another flip of the parties based on economic class. And then with that comes kind of social issues as well that are, I think, furthering this divide that we're having in the country. So that's kind of what I'm identifying. And look, we did a study we looked at a study that Brookings did after the last election in 2020. Biden won, based on counties, 70% of American GDP. Trump won 30%. Okay, so the whole concept of like a Rockefeller Republican who used to say like I'm socially liberal and fiscally conservative, which is like what all of us in New York like to say, like that phrase is dead. It doesn't make sense anymore in the current context. So that said, 30% of American GDP though is still the third largest economy in the world if you do the math. And so that's actually the cohort of, we'll call it Red America or Patriotic America, that is not having any product sold to them. And so later on in the conversation, we get to why I think that's a huge total addressable market that no one's actually working on financially. And so that's part of the thesis that I have for what I'm doing financially, which obviously dovetails to some of the academic discussion we're having here.
And you mentioned that being, I'm looking at my notes,
Yeah.
EIG, which
Yeah.
I point out is in stark contrast to, I take it ESG.
Right. Yeah.
Share with us what EIG means. Also want to hear more on your thoughts, your thesis around this opportunity within this economy that you see.
Yeah, exactly. So around the same time that I'm pointing out how these parties are shifting, ESG starts to become, I think, a marketing scam around 2010, 2011 on Wall Street. I mean, Wall Street is good at one thing, figuring out other ways to make money when, and it's no surprise that it happens after the financial crisis. So that's really when it starts coming into the vernacular, ESG, and is promoted very heavily by Wall Street as a new asset class, when in fact, it's just, I think putting lipstick on a pig. No one even knows what it means. And to the extent that you've created indices of ESG, since everyone tries to raise their hand and say they're a part of it, it's underperformed the market more broadly. And so we were overdue for a backlash of ESG, which stands for like environmental social governance. And it's extremely nebulous, but I think that's by design. And I'm going to tip my hat to Vivek Ramaswamy, who is running for president right now, who wrote a book called Woke Inc., and who I've interacted with, and was, I think, the first person to eloquently attack this scheme. And what he did is he tried to identify and shine a light on the fact that the largest asset managers in the world, whether they're BlackRock, Vanguard, or State Street, were blindly investing the retirement accounts of Americans into corporations and then asking them to, basically incorporate ESG policies, or as this term has now become a term of art, woke-ism, into their policies. So, for example, he cites Exxon having to get out of fossil fuels, which seems somewhat antithetical to the ethos of Exxon. But that's what these powerful asset managers are able to do. And so it begs the question that if half of the country are red states, at least, and that you have treasurers of those states who have fiduciary duties to the state and their constituents that manage their retirement, why were they blindly giving it to these advocates of policies that they don't agree with? And so shining a light on that system, I thought, was brilliant and really did help act as a catalyst for the backlash that we're facing here now. And so you've even seen recently in the last month or so, Vanguard remove itself from the net zero initiative. And I think that's by and large as a result of the backlash that they're receiving from these kinds of initiatives, because people don't want this, or at least a large portion of the population doesn't want it. So I point that out in that that's the top, right? He's dealing with public companies and large multi-trillion-dollar asset managers. At the same time, that explains why public companies act the way that they do. And I'll just add one other rejoinder to it. At the same time, during COVID, we were all online using Twitter, Facebook. It was a huge wealth transfer from the middle class to big tech and the wealthiest people. But there was also a lot of censorship and suppression going on, purportedly at the hands of private actors, which were these large corporations. And a few things happened that caught my eye. One was, a refrain from the left to, right-leaning folks was, if you don't like these platforms, go build your own. And so you may recall that Parler came in and became the #1 downloaded social media app. And then Amazon, Facebook, and Google came together and basically helped deplatform this company. So Amazon Web Services took them down. And you weren't allowed to then download it on the app stores of either the Android phone or the iPhone, Apple and Google. So when I saw that, I was like, wow, that's effectively like just proof of this oligopoly or monopoly that's existing and has a tacit support of the feds. And so I started asking, like, why would you accept that? That seems to be like bona fide, like antitrust violation. And as it turns out with the Twitter files that you're seeing that Elon Musk has put out, it is because, in fact, the FBI was embedded in these organizations. And that is why you saw absolutely no counter narrative whatsoever around COVID. And it first took Alex Berenson, who was an intrepid journalist who was trying to push back against this narrative of the vaccines and COVID lockdowns. When he got to the discovery phase, Twitter settled with him, and then ultimately these files were released once Elon Musk took it over. And you see that the FBI is telling them who to deplatform. You can't do that because that's no longer a private business at that point. You're an arm of the federal government, and First Amendment constitutional protections apply. So I just set that up to demonstrate to you that people who are in tune with this now feel that the largest corporations are completely co-opted. Okay. And I've explained, that on one hand, they're being pushed to do things by these large asset managers that are antithetical to their views. And then secondarily, you have them being suppressed and censored, and in some cases deplatformed or fined, where you see that PayPal had put out a plan for fining people for misinformation. Okay, as they define it, by the way, it's always one way. How can you not see an opportunity now for a separate set of companies and in fact, an economy that does not go in only this direction? And so therein lies, I think, the opportunity I'm describing. And we call it EIG, which is an ecosystem of companies that abide by entrepreneurship, innovation, and growth, which we think are foundational principles of the United States. And so we also thought that if people are already focused on pressuring the largest asset managers at the top level, why don't we attack it from a bottom up as opposed to a top down? And that's in the area I already was at Farvahar. I started getting pitched by these companies when I was helping private businesses like, hey, I'm going to be the non-woke version of Facebook, or I'm going to be a payment processor that doesn't fine people, or I'm going to be a web host that's about free speech. And so I was like, there's a whole thing happening here. And so we actually put a dedicated vehicle together called 1789 Capital that's named after the Bill of Rights. And that's an attempt to finance the companies of tomorrow with institutional capital that is against what we call woke capital, because there are entrepreneurs that don't want to take woke capital, and there's no one providing it for them. So that's at the fund level what we've started in response to some of the macro events I've described to you. And you saw me talk about this issue over a year and a half ago in Miami when I was interviewing the CEO and founder of Rumble, which is a perfect example of this space. And also with my SPAC, I've done something in this space too, because SPACs are a very elegant expression of people being able to support the movement that they feel with their own dollars, because they can just go and buy the stock. So I said a lot there, but I wanted to try to tie it together.
Sure. No, and I have like more follow-ons, especially, someone who comes from like a deep financial background. I imagine you probably looked at like the size of the opportunity and the market.
Yeah.
What do you think that opportunity, what does that look like? How do you kind of think about that, quantify it?
Yeah. From a GDP perspective, we think it's 7 trillion, which is just enormous. And again, that's just back of the envelope math based on who the folks are that voted for Trump. And that undercuts it because there's a lot of people who don't like Trump and didn't vote for him yet, but he still got the second most amount of votes of any presidential candidate in history. About 73 million people voted for him in 2020. So let's call it that there's probably even another 20 or 30 million. So that number is probably higher because half the country doesn't vote. So that's the area. And I think it's also stipulated that every other week there's some sort of cultural controversy about, oh, this is super woke, super leftist, it's pissing people off. But all I've seen is like these more conservative or traditional purchasers or consumers get angry and complain, but they don't ever know where to go because the largest companies, which now dominate most areas of commerce, are not providing them an option because they've decided that, it's better to cater to this side of the country, they rightfully assume that when it comes down to it, if it's an either or zero sum, they have more money. So I think that's part of why it's gone so far. But again, this is very different than how I grew up. Like in the 90s, like companies were just totally agnostic. They never got into politics. A lot of that, I think, is also related to your industry. Like journalism has changed dramatically. Like we're much more like the United Kingdom now, where you have like right and left papers. Like, you know, when you're signing on to the website or the app of a certain periodical, like what they think. The New York Times today is very different than the New York Times in the 1990s. It might have been center left. Now it caters very much to probably their 9 million subscribers. Technology has affected this. When you are catering rather to a national advertiser who has an entire country that they want to cater to, which has now changed, but now you're catering, the majority of your revenues of the New York Times has followed a tech model of subscription as a service, then you're looking to really get after the people that are going to pay that monthly subscription fee. And then that pushes it directly to the most rabid folks. And that's effectively what they are. They're a tech and entertainment platform. And that's okay, as long as we're just going to be honest about it. But I'm certainly not going to lionize historical institutional periodicals anymore, because that's not their business model. They're in it to make money. And that's okay, but let's all just recognize that. So sorry to digress. I just wanted to point out that it's permeated through every industry.
No, I mean, it's
including yours.
Yeah, feel free to go on for as long as you want, because this show is about my guests. It's certainly not about me. And also what I love about it is I have a diverse set of guests and opinions and conversations, and I'm just trying to facilitate so folks can like learn and also just decide for themselves. Let me ask you a follow-on, because you're talking like referencing back to like the 90s and like how things have changed over time, and whether it's business or media. And it just kind of makes me think, and I don't know the full context of it, but I know there was like that famous Michael Jordan quote of like, Republicans buy sneakers to, I guess it was like to not like jump into that fray. Do you think that we are going to see going forward? I don't know if you want to call it like a bifurcation of like the economy, but more ESG kind of, or taking more stances on those issues versus, you're talking about like EIG, more like patriotic kind of red America. Do you think that we'll see a division in the economy? Is that like a long-term trend that you see? Or maybe my question's a terrible question. It's not the right one to ask, but would love to hear your thoughts.
No, I think it's exactly the right question. It is in fact the essence of everything we're talking about. My thesis, I should be explicitly clear, is yes, 100% I see that happening. I believe, and that was the analogy I was kind of drawing somewhat inartfully earlier, you would accept now that we have two different governing philosophies state by state, right? Like where you went is probably quite different from the way that New York wants to govern itself. I can tell you Florida is very different. Florida has a higher population than New York, yet the state budget is half of the size of New York's. Florida has no state income tax. New York has arguably the highest when you include the city in the country. Florida has a budget surplus. New York has a deficit. Okay, so like I'm a data numbers person. Who's doing better there? And I'm not even trying to go into the qualitative stuff. Like I'm on that side. Like that's how I would want my business run or my state run. So, so that's what's happening at the state governing level. The next step of this, I think, look, some people like have nostalgia for the past. I certainly do, but it's not coming back. So if that's the case, then of course you have to have a separate economy as well. And I think this is all under what the founders actually had thought of, which was extreme federalism. Like the federal government is supposed to have limited powers and not supposed to nationalize everything, because we are meant to be very different and allow governance at the local level. So what I'm calling for is like the federalization under like federalism wise of the economy also. And some people say, oh, that's too bad. Now there are going to be products for these people versus these people. Well, it's already been one way for 10 years. Of course, this other huge market is going to have demand and needs people to cater to it. So, to answer that question with an example, the SPAC that I have announced a deal at the end of February with a company called PublicSq. So PublicSq you can think of as basically the Amazon for this new economy. It's a digital app that you can download on your phone, and it's just a marketplace. It's companies are unabashedly patriotic, want to make their products in the US and have values, and so people that go on that app that are fed up with, again, I'm going to just use this catch-all phrase of wokeism, can go and perform their commerce with these businesses and find them locally or nationally. And so when Bud Light decides to put, the transgender person as like a face, and you see how much that angered Bud Light, which is very clearly like a middle America product. Again, their head of marketing was located in Brooklyn, which might say something about whether that was the smartest thing to try to have a national brand with someone who sits there. But look, there's a big backlash. So now when that happened, the PublicSq app had an 800% increase in searches for beer because people are looking for alternatives. And the reason I wanted to take PublicSq public was because it can serve as a foundation of this new economy. In any economy, whether it's modern day with digital or historically, the place that commerce was conducted was like an exchange or a bazaar. People would go and meet and try to exchange goods. So now it's become digital. So if we believe there's going to be a patriot economy, which I know there is because it's already out there, then PublicSq, this app, will be the foundation of it. Because the problem that this patriot economy has had is that they haven't been able to connect with one another. You've just had monoline products come out, but there hasn't been one repository where you can transparently find and conduct business with a company you can trust if you have those kinds of values. And so that's what PublicSq is trying to do.
Yeah. What you mentioned like an 800% spike in search for beer. What can you share with us about like the numbers or the size of like who's using it? Yeah.
We have just put out an 8K, I think, like last week, that even though the company has only been like live for less than a year, we have over like 650,000 active users, which means you filled out all the forms, you're using it, like you're signed up, you put in all your information, which is insane because when you look at the growth, it's up just in the last month and a half, like over 25%. So we're just scratching the surface. I mean, this thing should have, once it's fully baked, I mean, think about the amount of people I just told, they could all be using it. That's what's in front of us here. And I want to make something clear, like what I have is an academic thesis based on, some empirical data, anecdotes. And so I'm like looking at something and I have a really strong belief it's there. Obviously, I'm putting my money where my mouth is, but we are like at the top, maybe the bottom of the first of this. That's how early it is. This is like ESG in 2011. It hasn't even begun yet, but that's what this is right now. So like we're right at the beginning of it, and I'm trying to be a first mover here. In the social network, when they had Facebook, the movie, he's like, I don't know what this is. I just know that it's cool. Like they didn't even know what they were sitting on when he was making Facebook, because he used to have the .edu address at the end. It was just for college kids.
Yeah.
They didn't know they were going to have the largest advertising engine, like mail order advertising business digitized in the world that we've ever seen, because then ultimately that's how it became a profitable, or a revenue generating business. But first you build it. And what I'll tell you is, half the country seems like a pretty amazing TAM to me.
Mm-hmm. And how about, let me ask you, like maybe on more of a micro personal anecdotal level, how have you changed any of your kind of behavior, whether it's like purchasing behavior? I know you moved to Florida and whatnot, but has this driven you to make changes on that like micro level?
100%. I think that, look, it's very difficult, but to the extent that I can identify if something is made in China, like I'm not buying it, and people, I think by and large, I think yearn for a more unified country or a patriotic country. It's been made so hard to do that because everybody just goes on Amazon because it's the incumbent and it's the easiest thing to use. But if you actually spend like a few minutes looking at that, 90% of what you purchase on there is from China. Every time we do that, we're supporting someone that does not have our best interests. Like China, has global ambition. And what I don't think folks understand, and maybe I might enter into another topic of TikTok. Mm-hmm. So TikTok is a just incredible microcosm for the issue, right? This is the most downloaded app, one of them in our country, even though it's effectively Chinese spyware. No one seems to care, or at least really look into these things. The servers are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and yet children in this country are putting the most private details, either audio, video, in writing, on a server that they control. So think about the blackmail that they're going to have when these kids come of age. They don't seem to think about these things. And yet we have, foolish Congress people trying to protect this company. It is a modern day opium war. Like, that's how they think. And this is a Trojan horse that they've unleashed into the United States that we blindly and as zombies are just taking on and using without any ramifications. And if you look at the content that they push on children, it's all very peculiar, like anti-family type stuff, weird challenges that can harm people on TikTok here. Whereas there, they shut off the app after a certain amount of hours on their children in China. And the algorithm pushes like science and math. So it's like right there, if you look at what they're trying to do, what a brilliant thing is to like harm the next generation. And this is something that I think people have to be very cognizant of, is like the end of our society, like an enlightened society of a Western democracy, is the end of a middle class. Like a middle class or bourgeoisie is the foundation of a democracy. And as I've already described to you, the statistics demonstrate how our middle class has been effectively eviscerated over the period of time that we're talking, kind of like since I've gotten out of college. Like, let's call it really, again, it's not a coincidence. It directly correlates to when China was admitted into the World Trade Organization. Mm-hmm. And then the second part of it is like the destruction of like the family. Those are the two kind of bulwarks we have against authoritarian control: strong family, strong middle class. And that allows entrepreneurship to flourish and independence. And so let's again look at COVID for a moment. They effectuated, well, first Biden tried to do an unconstitutional mandate. He tried to use OSHA to force people to take an experimental shot, which was obviously, thankfully, deemed unconstitutional, which it clearly was by the Supreme Court. That said, he wanted to effectuate it through private business. And so you had people's liberty being taken away who didn't want to take that shot because they would have lost their health care that's provided by their employer and their livelihood. And so they were presented with a catch-22, basically. And it was done through private business. And so I make that point just as like a broader one to think about. When you work for a large corporation, you're ceding liberty to a certain extent because they control every aspect of your life. And it's that, and this is what actually RFK Jr. has been talking about very eloquently since he announced, is this capture between the private side, large corporations, and the government, that they're now working hand in glove, depriving us of our Bill of Rights. And that's a very scary prospect. And I was not, as we've talked about, someone who was obsessed with like liberty and the Bill of Rights. Like, I thought that was all kind of academic and abstract. But when you see something like the COVID response, you're like, wow, these issues really matter. They were on something in 1776. And so they were willing to, folks in their 20s and 30s and 40s die for that, to create what I think is the greatest country, ever. And you asked me to get a little bit personal, so I will for a moment. I'm the child of immigrants, right? So like my story couldn't happen anywhere else. I think that some folks that might not have that background might be a little bit complacent or take for granted how incredible this place is. So, my mom comes from Iran, and there was a revolution there in 1979 where the country kind of changed so dramatically. So if you have at least, some connection to a country falling, you understand that it's somewhat tenuous, and then you can contrast the way that those countries operate, the lack of freedom there versus to what we have in the US. And you see China, which, look, they don't have a Bill of Rights there. They have no respect for the individual. It's nothing like here. And they want to take us over. And so we should all be very, very concerned about that if you value the things that I believe most Americans do. But that's an if, I guess.
We've talked a lot about macro here, Omeed, and I kind of want to explore with you a bit more on the macro side. There's been a lot of conversation on this show around the rising tensions between the US and China. And I think you've alluded to that many, many times in this conversation as like the biggest geopolitical threat you see. I guess kind of looking out on the macro side of things, do you have like scenarios that you think about like how this plays out and what the role of the US will be like on the global stage?
Yeah, I think that the United States has to start just a bit of reciprocity as it relates to China. So if you haven't seen the movie The China Hustle, I definitely recommend it. It came out maybe about a decade ago. I'm not sure if Bethany's in it, but it's that cohort of Chanos and folks like that.
Oh, yeah. We have Carson Block on the show.
Right, and he's on it, yeah. So that's a very good movie that probably deserves more attention because it's similar. You have the financial crisis and small broker dealers are looking way to make money and they start touting China. And what they're selling to just regular Americans are these fake companies. And they're using our capital markets to do these reverse mergers. And it turns out the companies are complete frauds and people are buying them with their retirement. And you're buying ADRs. You don't even have real shares in the company. So when it falls, like there's no legal recourse for you. I don't think there's been anything done legislatively to stop that. China, with impunity is still able to not have their companies correspond to, GAAP financials. You don't have any recourse because you're not a real shareholder. They can access our capital markets. When you're a private business and you want to go to China, you have to cede 51% of your company to a local partner there. So there is actually no reciprocity whatsoever. We're the buffoons that just say, come here, make money off of us and our people. And if you go there, it's like you have to jump through any hoop to do any kind of business whatsoever. And so what I would say as an immediate step would be, yes, I know it's against the free market and this it's blasphemy to talk this way. Again, those views don't work anymore. Like Adam Smith had no idea that there would be a China with 1 billion people that has slave labor. Okay, it doesn't work. It's not an evil level playing field. So when you have trade agreements, you have to make sure that there's reciprocity. Otherwise, you're getting totally taken advantage of. The benefit has been, people are like, oh, the world's never been better. We've had all these people come out of poverty. Yeah, you have in the developed. China and India look amazing today than they did 20 years ago. I was in China in 1986 as a young child. It was a third world country. They didn't have one skyscraper back then. Okay, so thanks to us, they're now a powerhouse. We did that for them. What has the population of the United States done during that same period? The opposite. And it's why you have things in Western Europe, like the United Kingdom, where you had Brexit. It's the same backlash. It's not just based on nothing that these people are pissed off. So I think everyone should spend more time understanding why these kind of more nationalistic movements are occurring, because I think citizens have the trite expectation that their government will look out for them, that they will respect the border. I mean, one of the reasons why wages went up for African Americans during Trump, and people don't like to hear this, is because they reduced illegal immigration. So that had an impact on real wages. But large corporations don't want that because they want the cheap labor. So at some point, I'm not saying that I'm against free trade. I just don't think you can do free trade with a company that has 4x your population and has many nuclear warheads and wants to take you over. By all means, do trade with Mexico and Vietnam, right? Where we have control over those relationships, not one where you're ceding control to somebody else. I mean, COVID came from a lab in Wuhan. We all know this. And we were not able to properly investigate and provide any ramifications for that country for several reasons. Well, one, and this is, again, indicative of our broader problem, our policymakers were involved because the NIH was funding EcoHealth and gain of function research. So if they actually looked too closely, they'd see people like Fauci were involved. I digress. Step two, they make all of our drugs. So if you start to take an aggressive stance towards them, they're like, yeah, we're cutting that off. They also made all the PPE. So it's kind of genius. They unleashed this thing and we had to then go pay them for the products to protect ourselves from. How was that not like the watershed, like, as you said, like epiphany for everyone? Like, we need to stop this. It's a national security issue. It's not just an economic one. Like, we are not a sovereign country if an enemy is making all of our stuff. It's like a very simple concept. So, you know, I do believe that there's a total reevaluation of the relationship that has to occur. There will clearly be, you know, economic considerations that come with that, you know, could be moderate to significant. But in the long term, you might be able to still preserve the nation's sovereignty if you do that and find other trading partners that are aligned. But the notion of neoliberalism that came across after the Soviet Union fell, that the more you just trade with someone, the more liberal they'll become. That was the premise on which the international order took hold after 1990, has failed dramatically because China has become more authoritarian the richer we've made them. I don't see, you know, any Western democracies in the Middle East. I'm not sure if anybody does, but it's failed. So we need to start thinking of new approaches here because I'm a little bit sick and tired of both parties just using talking points, you know, from 1999.
Let me ask you this, like, on the direction we're heading, are you at all hopeful or optimistic for the future, or do you think we're kind of past a point of no return here?
Tremendously optimistic because I'm surrounded by people that understand the topics that we're talking about. And I think I have a lot of partners in helping me do what I'm doing. So I could have like gone into politics or do what all these other people do. And that's a worthy endeavor. And there's plenty of people doing that. And I donate to people who I think are going to make a change. And so I think that's only one aspect of it. But I've decided to do something, you know, fairly unprecedented, which is to merge, you know, my financial acumen into trying to help build out this other economy that is going to give people choice and empower their wallets and allow them to conduct commerce in a way that makes them feel free. Because I've said this before, like liberty can be infringed in commerce as well. Like you can have political freedom, but if your First Amendment rights are being violated, you're getting social credit scores like they have in China, which they want to bring here, based on, you know, what you say. You're not going to be able to buy insurance. You're not going to be able, you know, to get that mortgage, right? You've got plenty of anecdotes of people for the wrong views losing their bank accounts. Okay, that's a complete infringement of liberty, but it's happening at the behest of the private sector. Really, behind it is, you know, a Leviathan doing it. But that's why what I'm focused on is how do we keep us free on the private side with these corporations that are going to be immune to that kind of pressure and not just fold the way that so many others have. I mean, effectively, what I've described as a devil's bargain that has occurred is that the largest big tech companies have been insulated from Section 230 reform or antitrust regulation because they've agreed to do the dirty work for the government. That's why it's happening. Why haven't we done this otherwise? You think that a company the size of Google or Facebook needs Section 230 liability protection that was passed in 1996? And we haven't changed that because they own, like, it's like a symbiotic relationship with the government. So that's what's happening here. And so I'm part of a, you know, a movement, and I'm doing some things here that make me very hopeful because the reception has been so positive. So yeah, I'm tremendously hopeful. That's what makes this country the best, is that if you, I still believe, really want to work hard and be innovative, that the circumstances are there, that you can do it. We'll see whether I'll be as successful as I want, but so far I've been very pleased.
You know, gosh, okay, so like from what I understand, I've heard like my grandfather's like generation, like folks who would have been like in DC around that time, that like Republicans and Democrats, they used to get beach houses together, and I can't even fathom that today. But I guess like on the point of just being like having civility or bringing back civility, and it's okay to like not agree on everything. I guess I want to ask you maybe from like a personal perspective too, is, when you start to, kind of change and have this evolution over time, how did it impact, maybe negatively, maybe positively? Did it strengthen or weaken, relationships that you had? Did you find that some people in your life really agreed with you or others who didn't? I want to just kind of hear about that.
That's a great question. I think that if I describe myself, I'm just an independent thinker and I'm skeptical. Like that's just maybe as a lawyer, or I was always like that. I wouldn't go as far to say that I'm necessarily a contrarian, but I have those leanings. Like I don't always buy what I use. Like that's my that's the premise I operate under in everything. So people who have known me for a long time knew I was always like that. So the fact that I'm asking these questions or being super introspective and coming up with ideas is not inconsistent with my life. I've always been like this. But to the extent that it may now like affiliate with people that I had not in the past, I think for the most part, I have not faced really any issues because of the way that I talk. I'm not looking to attack people. I'm not bombastic in that way. I like to have these kinds of deeper conversations with people, and most of the folks that I still have in my life or have lasted would be of the same persuasion. Yeah, I was going to say people of a different persuasion, we can still talk and we can still try to get to the point that you are, which is I will always be civil with someone. Ultimately, if the differences are insurmountable, that's okay. They're entitled to their opinion. And that doesn't mean I'm going to look to like lose friendships or anything, but I also have to do what I think is right for me, my family, and for the country. And as long as I do that in a respectful way, like I'm super comfortable with it.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, Omeed, I really enjoyed having you on, and I want to give you a couple minutes. Let folks know where they can maybe, whether it's follow you on social media or learn more about the work that you and your firms are doing. If you just want to share a bit more, or even reemphasize the work that you're doing with your 3 different entities, please take a moment to do so.
Yeah, thank you. You can take a look at me on Twitter. It's @real Omeed Malik. I think I was verified for years, but now I guess on 420 you lose that. So maybe I have to go do the subscription, which is fine. I will support what he's doing because
I subscribed.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'm into what he's doing. I think it's free speech. So, generally speaking, so I will do that. That's probably the platform that I'm not particularly active, but more active than not. But that's a good way to follow me. And, we've got our websites, farvaharpartners.com, Colombier is the SPAC, and 1789 Capital is the fund. So those are the entities all doing different things. But, I think definitely willing to interact with anyone that wants to have any of these conversations. So I love having these talks, and of course, really enjoyed reconnecting with you after all these years, and, look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
Likewise. Well, Omeed, I really enjoyed having you on. I feel like I learned a lot, and I also just enjoyed listening to you and thinking about new and different ideas. I appreciate you being so generous with your time and your ideas. Omeed Malik, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Julie. I really appreciate it.
Hey everyone, I really hope you enjoyed that video. Be sure to hit that like button, the subscribe, and that bell so you won't miss any new videos.